Serious. Redditors who have worked graveyard shift, what was the creepiest/unexplainable stuff you saw? I was working the night shift fitting fire doors in an office block and managed to finish my tasks early. Since I couldn't head home until the alarm was set, I found a quiet spot to kill time and decided to watch the Exorcism of Emily Rose on my phone with my earphones in. I was about 45 minutes into the movie, right at the peak of a terrifying, bone-chilling scream, when every single light on the floor suddenly cut out, plunging me into total darkness. I nearly had a heart attack right then and there. As it turned out, I had been sitting so still for so long that the motion sensors decided the floor was vacant and the building's automatic power save kicked in. Needless to say, it was a very long walk to the exit in the dark. During his military service, my brother was assigned to guard duty at the base, which required him to patrol the perimeter every 45 minutes. On one of those late-night rounds, a strange, rhythmic whistling drifted out from the dense, foggy forest just beyond the fence. Thinking it might be a signal or an intruder, he reported the suspicious noise over the radio and headed into the mist to investigate. He moved cautiously toward the sound, only to find one of the new recruits. It turns out the soldier had been sneaking out to the woods every night to practice his flute in private where he wouldn't disturb the barracks. I worked the graveyard shift at a psychiatric facility, which is already a high-strung environment once the sun goes down. One night, I was on duty with a coworker who happens to share my first name. We were stationed in separate rooms when we both distinctly heard a voice call out our name. Thinking she needed assistance, I headed toward her room just as she was stepping out to see what I wanted. We stopped in our tracks when we realized that neither of us had spoken. We checked the ward, but every resident was fast asleep, and even if they weren't, none of the patients in that specific area were verbal. We were the only two staff members on the floor. The air in the hallway felt instantly colder. Even now, years later, whenever we work a shift together, we eventually bring up that night and the voice that knew exactly what to call us. In Japan, the weight of the ancestors is felt everywhere. The culture is deeply tied to those who came before. I've seen my fair share of elderly figures in places they simply shouldn't be, but nothing unsettled me quite like my trip to Aokigahara, the Sea of Trees, or more infamously, the Suicide Forest. A Japanese friend and I made a bet to see if we could survive a full night alone in the dense woods. We brought rolls of pink plastic tape, marking a trail about 2 miles off the main path, so we wouldn't get lost in the disorienting terrain. The night itself was relatively uneventful, but we both admitted to a crushing sensation of being watched by hundreds of eyes from the very moment we stepped off the designated trail. We hiked out the next morning, feeling relieved to leave the oppressive atmosphere behind. It wasn't until later that we learned the timing of our trip. Unbeknownst to us, the government conducted its first annual body sweep the day after we departed. They recovered 26 bodies, several of which were found agonizingly close to where we had pitched our tent. Working the graveyard shift as a medic, you see plenty of tragedy, but every so often, you encounter something that defies a logical debrief. Around 2 a.m., my partner and I were dispatched to a man-down call in a quiet, upscale suburb. The caller was a frantic woman who claimed she couldn't wake her husband before the line went dead. Dispatch couldn't get her back on the phone. Since we were first on scene and every second counts in a cardiac arrest, we didn't wait for the police. We geared up with the monitor, med bag, and oxygen and headed inside. The house was immaculate, but strange. Every single light was on, and though it was the middle of the night, the windows were wide open with the drapes billowing in a cool breeze. We searched every room, yelling for the residents, but the house was tomb silent. No woman, no husband, not even a pet. We radioed in that the patient was nowhere to be found and stepped back out to the driveway to wait for PD. Then, things got surreal. I looked at my watch and it beeped 3 a.m. My partners did the same. Our computer confirmed it, 3:01 a.m. We had arrived at 2:04 a.m. and only performed a 5-minute sweep, yet an entire hour had vanished. We blinked, rubbed our eyes, and looked again. The clock suddenly read 2:15 a.m. When the police finally arrived, we walked them through the empty house. As we stood near the garage, a heavily locked addition that had been dark during our initial sweep, an officer froze. He heard a woman's voice coming from beneath the floorboards. We all heard it. Suddenly, every light in the house flickered and died. A massive blast of cold air rushed through the open doors, followed by a thunderous pounding from inside the locked garage, as if someone were trying to kick their way out. The police breached the garage door and found a man in his 60s lying on the concrete. He was delirious and dehydrated, having slipped on motor oil earlier that afternoon. He'd been trapped there for hours with a broken hip and ribs. As we loaded him into the ambulance, an officer asked, "Where's the woman who called?" "Your wife." The man looked up weakly. "My wife has been dead for 10 years. I live here alone." "Then who called 911?" The man had no answer. There might be a rational explanation for the glitch in time or the voice we all heard, but the heavy malice we felt in that house only evaporated the moment we found him. I like to think his wife was still looking out for him, but I'll never forget the bone-deep unease of those missing minutes. Working the night shift as a hospital security guard usually involves quiet rounds and locked doors, but one night, I received a call from the ER that I'll never forget. When I arrived, a nurse stepped out of a patient room holding a standard pink plastic wash basin. She held it out to me instinctively. I took it from her without thinking, only looking down once I had a firm grip. The basin was about half full of blood and visceral material, wispy, translucent membranes floating in the fluid like a school of jellyfish. "Nurse," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "what exactly am I holding?" She explained that a woman had been brought in by ambulance and had suffered a miscarriage. "Okay," I replied, "but why am I holding it in a wash basin?" As it turned out, hospital policy required that the remains be transported to the maternity ward for reporting and examination. Since the ward was on the complete opposite side of the building and the ER was slammed, the task fell to security. I didn't ask any more questions. I simply turned and began the long trek through the vast, empty halls of the hospital. It was just me and the basin. In the silence of the night shift, curiosity eventually got the better of me. As I walked, I couldn't help but peer down into the tub, staring at the fragments of what would have eventually been a child. The entire experience was deeply surreal and more than a little unsettling, a heavy, somber weight to carry through those sterile corridors. I just focused on my footing. If nothing else, I was determined not to trip. When I was a teenager, I needed cash to fund my Warhammer 40K addiction and save for a car, so I took a solo overnight cleaning job at a local supermarket. During the interview, the manager warned me that no one ever stayed longer than 3 months. People just quit without explanation. I scoffed, thinking it was easy money since I lived right around the corner. My first night started smoothly at 11 p.m. But around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor and loud banging coming from the storage area above me. Knowing the building was locked and I had a direct view of the only entrance, I tried to be a badass. I ran up the stairs and shoved the door open, expecting a squatter. Instead, I found a dark, perfectly organized storage room filled with silent chairs and shelves. There wasn't a soul in sight. As the weeks went by, the activity escalated. I'd be stocking a shelf and hear a sharp crack as an egg smashed on the floor directly behind me. I'd hear the distinct crinkling of chip packets being squeezed by invisible hands. The movement upstairs never stopped. It sounded like a nightly game of musical chairs. By the 3-month mark, things turned aggressive. An egg was hurled directly at me, and the heavy front door blew wide open of its own accord. Most people would have sprinted out right then, but I really needed the money. My solution? I started showing up to my shifts totally hammered. I'd spend the night laughing at the ghosts, getting drunk enough to heckle whatever was haunting the aisles. One night, the murky twilight of the store's low-budget night lighting felt heavier than usual. I was working at 3 a.m. when I noticed a massive, inky black blob in the middle of the produce section, stretching all the way to the ceiling. When I shone my flashlight at it, the beam didn't pass through. It was just swallowed by the darkness. Fueled by liquid courage, I took a swig of bourbon, called the shadow a pussy, and went back to work. 5 minutes later, I looked up. The blob had moved significantly closer. I gave it the finger and kept working until, suddenly, the air felt like it was spinning. The weight of the atmosphere shifted, and my entire night's work of stacked boxes was swiped onto the floor. I yelled at the empty air, fixed my stack, and decided it was time to leave. As I headed out, the morning sun was rising in the east, shining directly toward the glass entrance. I stepped outside and locked the door, but when I turned back to look through the glass, the interior of the store was pitch black. It was as if the sun couldn't penetrate the building. As I stared, the lock I had just turned made a distinct click, and the door slowly swung open, as if inviting me back into the dark. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I slammed the door shut, jumped on my bike, and pedaled home as fast as I could. I stayed at that job for another 6 months, but I never looked back through that glass again. Working the graveyard shift at a jail means you eventually see everything, but some sights defy any logical explanation. One night, while I was performing a routine floor check, I glanced into a cell and stopped dead in my tracks. Standing right in the center of the room was an inmate who, by all rights, shouldn't have been on his feet. He was a one-legged man who was strictly wheelchair-bound. Not only was he standing, but he was in the middle of a set of squats while holding his entire wheelchair over his head like a trophy. It wasn't exactly supernatural, but seeing that level of sheer, impossible physical exertion in the middle of the night was profoundly surreal. Then there is the other regular on the midnight block. Every night, without fail, he moves to the far corner of his cell and engages in intense, full-length conversations with someone who isn't there. He uses animated hand gestures and bursts into fits of genuine laughter, as if someone just told him a joke. Other nights, the tone shifts. He becomes visibly shaken and screams in a fury at the empty corner. What makes it truly unsettling isn't just the talking. It's that he never does this during the day. He only begins his dialogue once the sun goes down, standing perfectly still in that corner, staring at something the rest of us can't see. Last year, after Hurricane Matthew hammered the coast, the oceanfront hotel where I work was forced to shut its doors for 3 months. Since the building was empty, the management kept me on my regular graveyard shift to handle maintenance and security. The hotel is a medium-sized property, 8 floors and 104 rooms, and while being alone in a building that size is inherently eerie, one specific incident still sticks with me. I was performing a routine security sweep, climbing the stairs to check that every door was locked. As I usually do to kill the silence, I was listening to music on my phone. Just as I reached the upper floors, I paused the track for no particular reason. The moment the music cut out, the silence was shattered by a woman's voice singing a single, clear opera note. It was a sustained, mid-tone note that lasted about 2 seconds. It wasn't a mechanical hum or a distorted echo from my own speakers. The quality of the sound was far too human and distinct for that. I froze on the landing, standing in absolute, dead silence for several minutes, waiting for another sound. Nothing followed. I've never been much of a believer in the supernatural, but standing in the heart of a vacant, storm-battered hotel and hearing a phantom soprano certainly tested my skepticism. With another hurricane season approaching, the building is more reinforced than ever, but I'm still hoping the only voices I hear this time around are coming from my headphones. I worked the 3rd shift as a security guard at a local aquarium, a job that usually meant peaceful, solitary walks through darkened galleries. However, after a few nights, the silence was broken by something deeply unsettling, the sound of a desperate, wheezing gasp for breath. It sounded like someone was drowning right in front of me, fighting for air. I spent months investigating, rushing toward the sound every time it echoed through the massive concrete halls, but I always found nothing. I'd be midway through my rounds when that sharp, struggling inhale would cut through the hum of the filtration systems, sending a chill down my spine. What made it truly disturbing was the reaction, or lack thereof, from the exhibits. I would watch the tanks closely, but none of the animals ever flinched or turned their heads. It was as if the sound existed only for me, a phantom suffocation echoing in a building full of water. Even after months on the job, I never got used to the feeling of being the only witness to those invisible lungs gasping for air. I worked the graveyard shift at an Amazon warehouse that had previously been a Zappos facility. On particularly slow nights, management would often send most of the staff home, and one evening I found myself practically alone. There were only 2 other employees in the entire building, an enormous, 5-story cavern filled with hundreds upon hundreds of towering racks. Even on a busy day, you could go hours without crossing paths with another person. On this night, the silence was absolute. As I moved through the aisles, I began to see a flash of red. It was subtle at first, the sleeve of a shirt or the edge of a jacket disappearing around the corner of a rack just as I turned into an aisle. It happened again and again, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Someone in red was moving through the warehouse, seemingly staying just one turn ahead of me. I tried to shake it off, but the consistency of it started to get to me. When the clock finally hit lunch, I made a point of heading to the break room specifically to see what my two coworkers were wearing. One was in a gray hoodie, and the other was wearing black. Neither of them had a stitch of red on them. I spent the rest of the shift looking over my shoulder, wondering who, or what, had been navigating those 5 floors alongside me. I work for an ambulance company on the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. Between calls, we post at specific locations throughout our coverage area to wait for the next dispatch. We have a few favorite quiet spots, including one at the dead end of a street where a housing development had stalled out. It's a location that's incredibly difficult to stumble upon. You really have to know it's there to find it. One night, we backed the rig into our usual spot so we could pull out quickly if a call dropped. About 45 minutes into the wait, we noticed a 4-door sedan cruising up the empty street. Since we were completely isolated, we immediately locked the doors. The car performed a U-turn right in front of us, and for a second, we thought they were leaving. Instead, the driver threw it in reverse and backed up until they were right alongside our passenger side. At this point, I had my radio in hand, ready to call for help if things turned south. 4 men in their mid-20s stepped out of the sedan. Without saying a word, they began circling the ambulance, taking photos from every possible angle. I even hit them with the high-intensity floodlights to let them know we were watching and to try to get them to back off, but they were completely unfazed. After snapping about 10 pictures, they all climbed back into the car and drove off into the night. To this day, I have no idea what they were looking for or why they needed photos of our rig in the middle of nowhere. I worked the graveyard shift at a taxi dispatch office housed in a very old building with an attached mechanic's garage. Local legend says a man once took his own life in that garage, though I've never seen any hard evidence to back it up. I do know for a fact, however, that the previous manager passed away right here in his office. The place is constantly restless. The kettle and microwave have a habit of turning themselves on. The wall clock has fallen more times than I can count, and the hand dryer in the bathroom often roars to life while I'm the only person in the building. But the most unsettling incident happened recently. From my desk, I have a clear line of sight through the office door and straight down a long, tiled corridor. The doors in this building are notorious for their loud, piercing squeaks, so it's impossible for anyone to move through the halls undetected. I was sitting there one night, caught between my work and a movie, when I heard a distinct clicking noise growing louder. I looked over the top of my monitor and stared down the hallway. There, rolling steadily across the tiles toward me, was a single silver ball bearing. No door had opened, no floorboard had creaked, and there wasn't a soul in sight. I watched it until it stopped. Then I picked it up and put it in my pocket. I still have it. This one falls into the category of creepy but explainable, though it certainly left an impression at the time. I was pulled over on a pitch-black stretch of road, sitting in my patrol SUV during a quiet shift. To pass the time, I was listening to the Anything Ghost podcast, a show where a very mellow-voiced host narrates listener-submitted ghost stories. I was deep into a particularly atmospheric tale when I shifted in my seat and accidentally brushed the control for the rear windshield wiper. The sudden, jarring screech of the wiper dragging across the bone-dry glass, right at the most suspenseful point of the story, sent such a jolt through my system that I ended up with muscle cramps that lasted for hours. Once my heart rate settled and I confirmed that there wasn't actually someone or something clinging to the back of the vehicle, I had a good laugh at my own expense. It ended up being the only real excitement I had to deal with for the rest of the night. I work the graveyard shift at a hotel, and I'm definitely not the only one who has encountered the unexplained here. Several other night shift employees have reported similar oddities. We lock all the exterior doors after a certain hour, so these experiences always happen when the building is supposedly secure. I've walked back into a room to find cabinet drawers pulled wide open, heard the distinct rhythm of footsteps in empty halls, and I frequently deal with the prickling sensation of being watched. However, the most bizarre incident happened just a few weeks ago. I was in the restroom, which features a mirror positioned so you can see the automatic paper towel dispenser on the opposite wall. As I was washing my hands, I heard the motor hum to life. I turned around just in time to see the machine dispense a fresh towel entirely on its own. As I stood there watching, the bottom of the paper towel suddenly lifted upward, as if caught by an invisible hand, and stayed suspended in the air for several seconds before dropping limp. I checked for a draft, but there are no air vents anywhere near that dispenser. It sent a massive chill down my spine, but honestly, it was one of the more fascinating things I've witnessed on the job. Aside from the usual overnight crowd of addicts, working the graveyard shift at a pharmacy was mostly just a quiet way to get some reading done. But one night, around 1 a.m., a man walked in who I still can't quite categorize. He looked like he had stepped directly out of the 1950s, wearing a tailored brown suit that looked like it cost thousands of dollars. Despite looking to be in his upper 90s, he moved with a strange, jerky gait. He walked up to my register and asked, in a flat, monotone voice, if he could wait for his friend. "Sure," I said. "Where's your friend coming from?" "New York City," he replied. "He left about 15 minutes ago." I pointed out that New York was a 12-hour drive away. He just chuckled. "Nah, let's just say we can get around a lot faster than most." The way he spoke was as unsettling as what he said. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes and spoke in broken, rhythmic sentences. He spent the next half hour wandering the aisles, claiming he was looking for trinkets from my state. When he returned, his cart was overflowing with the most generic items imaginable: random snacks, books, and electronics you could find in any store across the country. He asked me to watch his cart while he went outside. About 30 minutes later, another customer came in looking shaken, telling me a guy outside was creeping him out. I stepped out to find the old man perched on a bench in a full crouch, an impossible physical feat for someone his age. When I told him his posture was a bit strange, he stood up and stared at the bench with genuine, deep confusion, as if he didn't understand how furniture worked. 20 minutes later, a man in his 20s wearing a onesie and light-up shoes came skipping into the store. He was singing and acting ultra-friendly, with a wide smile that never reached his eyes. He kept the device shielded from my view with his body, moving whenever I tried to get a look at it. "Have you seen my friend?" he asked playfully. "I just got down from New York. Left an hour or two ago." "The guy in the brown suit?" I asked. The old man walked back in at that moment. The two of them hugged and immediately began a bizarre, choreographed dance in the middle of the pharmacy. The younger man ran to the back to grab beer, shouting, "Give me a second, let me get some drinks for the FLI road." He paid with a credit card that was completely blank, no name, no numbers, just the magnetic strip on the back. They cracked their beers, walked out into the night, and vanished. I'm still not sure if I met a pair of eccentric travelers or if I spent my shift as a waypoint for something not from this planet. I was walking into work around 10 p.m., heading from the parking garage toward the hospital entrance. As I reached the 5th floor, a series of sharp, incredibly loud popping noises echoed through the concrete structure. The sound was jarring, though it didn't quite match the booming report I always imagined a gun would make. Curious and a bit unsettled, I walked to the edge of the deck and looked over the railing. Far below, I spotted 3 kids sprinting down the street, disappearing into the night. About an hour into my shift, the atmosphere in the building shifted. A coworker mentioned that the ER had just received a shooting victim. I never heard another word about it, and there was no way to confirm if the pops I heard and the runners I saw were linked to the trauma downstairs. To this day, I can't say for sure what happened, but that specific, sharp sound remains etched in my memory. I work as a pizza delivery driver, and one late night, I had a drop-off at an elderly residential complex. The moment I stepped through the main entrance, I was hit by a sudden, heavy sense of dread. The lobby was cavernous and silent, bearing an unsettling resemblance to the Overlook Hotel from The Shining. It just felt like the walls were thick with a strange, eerie history. As I stepped into the elevator, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering to how many people must have passed away in those rooms over the decades. Right as that thought crossed my mind, the elevator doors began to slide shut, only to stop dead in their tracks midway. They stayed frozen, slightly ajar, for a solid 7 seconds. I stood there in the center of the car, heart hammering, half expecting some horror movie entity to snatch me through the gap. Finally, the doors shuttered and finished closing. I delivered the pizza and got out of there as fast as I could, but the feeling that I had narrowly avoided some kind of unseen harm stayed with me for the rest of the shift. Working the night shift at a psychiatric hospital provides its own unique brand of fear. I was stationed on a floor directly beneath the unit for patients with autism and developmental disabilities, and the ceiling often acted as a conductor for the activity above. Not long after I started, the heavy silence of the night was shattered by an ungodly, drawn-out shriek followed by a series of violent, rhythmic thuds across the ceiling. I was convinced I was listening to a murder in progress. My coworker, who frequently pulled shifts on that upper unit, saw the sheer terror on my face and didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Oh, that's just a resident," she said casually. She does that sometimes when she wakes up. She just ran out of her room and headed down the hall. Even with the logical explanation, those sudden screams and slams echoing out of the darkness never failed to make my hair stand on end. Now, I work at a facility that serves as a mother house and assisted living center for elderly nuns. The building dates back to the late 19th century, and since most of the residents are in their 80s or 90s, this is where many of them spend their final days. The atmosphere here is heavy with a different kind of energy. More than once, I've walked past a room I know is vacant only to see the lights burning brightly inside. I'll be doing my rounds in a completely empty wing and hear the faint, tinny sound of a radio playing music behind a locked door. It's a quiet, reverent kind of haunting, but it's definitely weird. My brother works the graveyard shift as a janitor at a local elementary school. Toward the end of one shift, he was taking a break in a dark office, winding down by watching YouTube videos with his headphones on. Out of nowhere, the silence was shattered by a child's voice, loud and clear, asking him to clean my bench. Startled, he ripped his headphones off and searched the office, then the hallway, but the school was entirely empty. He even replayed the video he had been watching, thinking the audio might have bled through, but there was no voice in the recording. He was left standing in the dark with no logical explanation. As he stood there, he remembered a memorial bench on the school grounds dedicated to a young boy who had been hit by a car and killed about a year earlier. Shaken, my brother went outside to the memorial. He spent the next few minutes meticulously tidying the area and wiping down the bench until it was spotless. Only then did he feel a sense of peace, though he remained visibly rattled by the encounter. The boy's sister still attends the school, and my brother sees their mother frequently. I asked him if he ever planned on telling her what happened that night, but he said no. He just makes sure that, from now on, that specific bench is the cleanest part of the school. I worked the graveyard shift as a security guard at a facility with several massive warehouses. On Christmas Day, I was the only person on the entire property, a total skeleton crew of one, which usually promised a quiet, easy night. While I was making my rounds, I noticed one of the bay doors to a warehouse had been left wide open. Since that was a major breach of protocol, I headed over to investigate. To save on utility costs, the facility uses motion-activated lighting throughout the warehouses. Each light only triggers when you are directly underneath its sensor, and they shut off almost instantly once you move out of range. The result is a building that remains in pitch-black darkness unless something is physically moving through it. As I stepped through the open bay door and peered into the cavernous space, I noticed a single light flick on at the far end of an aisle, roughly 300 yards away. Then, the next light in the sequence clicked on. Then the next. The lights were advancing toward me in a perfect, rhythmic line, exactly as if someone were walking at a steady pace down the aisle. I stared into the glow, but the space beneath the lights was absolutely empty. There was nothing, no person, no animal, just the invisible weight of something triggering the sensors as it approached my position. I watched the lights track across the facility for a few more seconds before the hair on my neck stood up. I decided I'd seen enough, backed out of the bay door, and noped myself right out of there. I never found a technical explanation for it, but I've never forgotten that invisible walk. Years ago, I served as a maritime officer aboard a container ship navigating the Indian Ocean. During one of my night shifts, a blip appeared on the radar, an object on a direct collision course with us. It was a remarkably clear night with a calm sea and a nearly full moon, yet when we looked out from the bridge, we saw absolutely nothing. For nearly an hour, we tracked the object as it maintained its speed and bearing, still locked on a path to strike us. Unable to get a visual confirmation, we called the captain to the bridge. In total, 5 men, including the captain and 2 seasoned officers, stood staring at the displays, unable to reconcile the data with the empty horizon. The captain eventually ordered an evasive maneuver, but the ship on the radar adjusted its course in perfect synchronization with ours, staying on a collision path. Both of our radars showed identical readings, and the electronic chart display, ECDIS, even pulled up a specific ship name and call sign. We hailed them repeatedly over the VHF radio, but the airwaves remained silent. As the distance closed, it became undeniable. There was nothing above the water. Despite the high probability of a technical glitch, the captain took no chances. He ordered the crew to muster at the lifeboats, ready to deploy the moment impact occurred, while he and the CEO remained on the bridge. When the dot on the radar finally merged with our own ship's position, it simply vanished. There was no jolt, no sound, and no debris. At the next port, experts were flown in to dismantle and inspect the radar systems, but they found absolutely no malfunctions. To this day, none of us can explain the ghost ship that followed us through the Indian Ocean. In a different life, I worked the graveyard shift at an inner-city fast food joint. It wasn't the kind of job that left you with funny stories. It was the kind that gave you a window into the raw, broken edges of humanity. I don't know which moment stays with me most. Maybe it was the pregnant woman who stumbled in with half of her teeth missing, her face a mask of terror as she begged for a place to hide from the husband who was currently hunting her down. Or the boy, not even 12 years old, who showed up at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, asking if there were any chores he could do just to keep himself busy because he had nowhere else to go. Then there was the man who pulled a knife, or the brutal brawl that erupted right outside the drive-thru window, ending with a man's glasses shattered into his own face. Even my breaks weren't an escape. I remember sitting in the outdoor dining area at 3 a.m., just trying to eat my lunch, when a group of guys casually circled back to offer me cocaine. People talk about the nightlife, but working those hours in that neighborhood showed me a side of the world that most people spend their entire lives trying to look away from. I've spent 15 of my 18 years in medicine working the night shift, covering almost every type of facility imaginable. While I've collected plenty of stories over the decades, one from a few years ago still stands out. We were caring for a woman named April who was nearing the end of her life. She was Native American, and her family reached out with a specific request. They asked if we could open the window so her spirit could depart. My charge nurse and I had to apologize profusely, explaining that the hospital windows were completely sealed and didn't open at all. April passed away a few hours later. A few days after she passed, I was sitting at the nurse's station directly across from her former room. I was expecting a new admission, so I had the room fully prepped. I had placed a slide board, a long, heavy piece of plastic used for transferring patients, flat on the center of the bed. As I sat there, I watched the slide board suddenly fly off the bed with incredible force, slamming into the far wall. The room was empty, and I was the only person anywhere near the doorway, still at least 20 feet away. I walked into the room, picked up the board, and said firmly, "April, you've passed away. You have to move on." That wasn't the end of it. Over the next week, we had several incidents where the heart monitor in that empty room would suddenly activate, displaying the distinct, slow rhythm of a dying patient despite no one being hooked up to the leads. Every time it happened, I would walk in and calmly remind her that she was dead and it was time to go. Eventually, the activity just stopped. I'd like to think she finally found her way out, even without the window. I worked as the nighttime security guard at a local park, pulling the 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. shift. The job was remarkably easy since the park closed at dusk. My primary responsibilities were locking the front gate and sitting in my car, trying to stay awake while reading. Occasionally, I'd have to chase off teenagers trying to sneak in to drink, but a quick flash of my light was usually enough to send them running. One night, after locking up, a bad sandwich caught up with me. I headed for the park's restroom, a small, utilitarian concrete building with working plumbing. Because of the concrete walls, the acoustics were incredible, and since I was the only person for miles, I wasn't exactly worried about the noise I was making. In a rare moment of silence, I heard it. The sound didn't echo as sharply as my own movements, but it was unmistakable. It sounded exactly like a child, a high-pitched, repetitive question drifting through the air. Asterisk, Mom. Asterisk. I froze. Hello, I called out. I was met with another small, tentative voice. Asterisk, Mom. Asterisk. The smart move would have been to bolt to my car, lock the doors, and hope that whatever ghost child was haunting the woods couldn't get through a window. But I was 20 years old and possessed more bravado than common sense. Eager to be the hero or the first victim of a horror movie, I set off into the dark to find the source. I wandered through the park, my heart hammering against my ribs, shouting hello every few steps. I kept telling myself that monsters weren't real and that if a child was actually lost and alone in the woods, I had to find them. Each of my shouts was answered with that same, heartbreaking asterisk, Mom. Asterisk. Finally, I traced the sound to a small gap in the foundation of one of the maintenance buildings. I knelt down and swept my flashlight over the opening. Instead of a ghost, I found a tiny black kitten. It looked hungry and scared, and its specific, high-pitched meow happened to mimic the word "mom" with terrifying accuracy. I tried to offer it some of my food, avoiding the sandwich that had betrayed me earlier, but the little guy was too skittish and vanished into the shadows of the foundation. I continued to hear that "mom" cry for about a week before the park went silent again. I really hoped the little guy eventually found a home that didn't involve haunted concrete foundations. My very first job was at a nightclub situated above a row of retail shops, right next to a massive multi-story car park. I worked the cloakroom at the entrance, a position that gave me a direct, unobstructed view of the concrete parking structure through the windows. About a week into the gig, around 1 a.m., the rush had died down and I was staring blankly out at the car park. Suddenly, I saw a body fall from the top level, plummeting past my line of sight toward the ground below. I bolted outside and ran to the edge of the terrace to look over, but the pavement below was completely empty. There was no one there. This wasn't a one-time trick of the light. It began happening at least once a week, always around 1 a.m. A figure would drop limply from the top floor and vanish into thin air just before impact. It happened so frequently that I began to memorize the details, the shape of the person, the specific clothes they were wearing, yet every time I mentioned it to the rest of the staff, they looked at me like I was crazy. No one else had ever seen or heard a thing. I eventually checked the CCTV footage, but the cameras didn't angle quite far enough to catch the drop. I even spent hours digging through local news archives to see if anyone had jumped or fallen there in the past, but I found nothing. It could have been my mind playing tricks on me in the early morning hours, but the image was always so vivid, so terrifyingly clear, that I still can't quite convince myself it wasn't real. This one isn't so much a mystery as it is a masterclass in atmosphere. Back in the 90s, while I was studying music at Birmingham University, I used to book my studio sessions for the graveyard shift, usually between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. It suited my workflow perfectly, but the environment was undeniably eerie. There is something deeply unsettling about being the only person on a campus that usually swarms with thousands of students. On a wild, windy night, with the Great Charles Street clock tower tolling the hours into the void, the isolation felt heavy. But the real horror factor came from the technology we were using. Back then, we still worked with 2-inch tape machines, and because tape was expensive, we constantly recycled it. You never knew what auditory ghosts were lurking on a reel from a previous session. My personal favorite was the time a Latin church choir surfaced through the monitors. Because of how the tape was loaded, it played in reverse, complete with that haunting, swelling reverse reverb, at 3 a.m. in the middle of a thunderstorm. I should clarify, though, that I wasn't always entirely alone. There were other studio rats pulling the same hours. And let me tell you, the only thing more chilling than hearing a backwards Latin choir in your own headphones is hearing it bleed through the walls from a room a few doors down while you're focused on rewiring a console in the dark. Good times. When I was younger, my mom worked the graveyard shift at a hospital that felt like it had one foot in another world. The floor directly above hers was notorious, an old, largely decommissioned psychiatric unit that everyone agreed was haunted. It was so well known that the hospital actually authorized ghost hunters and news crews to film segments up there. They captured footage of heavy doors swinging shut on their own and wheelchairs drifting down hallways. In one instance, a chair was filmed in one room, only to be found in a completely different room just minutes later with no one around to move it. My mom worked on the post-op surgery floor, mostly caring for elderly patients who were often a bit loopy from the anesthesia and pain medication. One night, while doing her rounds, she overheard a patient talking. He was politely but firmly turning down an offer of whiskey. My mom laughed and stepped into the room. "Who are you talking to? There's no one in here." The man didn't laugh back. He just gestured toward the shadows. "Oh, not you. The lady behind the door." My mom didn't stay to investigate. She finished her check and got out of there as fast as she could. Another time, a woman in a shared room called out to my mom to ask if the man in the bed next to her was okay. "He says he feels fine," the patient explained, "but he really wants to leave." My mom looked at the other bed. It was stripped bare. No sheets, no pillow, and absolutely no patient. The lady was the only living soul in the room. My mom has a lifetime's worth of stories like those, but those two always seem to stick with her the most. I'm a student nurse, and I work as an auxiliary to pay my way through university. One night, I was pulling the graveyard shift, 7 p.m. to 7:15 a.m., on an all-female elderly medical ward. It was a quiet night. Everyone was asleep except for one restless patient sundowning in another section, with an auxiliary assigned to keep an eye on her. I was performing comfort rounds, which basically involves checking that every patient is settled. If they're asleep, you just make a note and move on. All the beds on this ward were profiling beds, heavy, motorized frames used throughout the hospital. As I reached one woman's bedside and confirmed she was out cold, I started writing on her chart. Suddenly, the bed came to life. Every motorized function triggered at once. The entire frame began to rise toward the ceiling while the headrest and leg sections started folding upward simultaneously. It was like the bed was trying to fold the sleeping woman in half. Panicked, I lunged for the power cord and ripped it out of the wall. The movement stopped instantly. Remarkably, the patient didn't even wake up. Intellectually, I knew it was just a massive electrical fault, but in the middle of a dark ward in a hospital built over a century ago, it felt like something far more sinister. That incident reminded me of another night in the newer wing of the hospital. The building was constructed around a central courtyard, a narrow, empty gap enclosed by 9 stories of concrete walls that acted like a massive echo chamber. While I was on my break, an ungodly, inhuman howl began to echo through that space. It rippled up and down the walls, sounding exactly like what you'd imagine a banshee's wail to be. It was the kind of sound that gives you deep, primal goosebumps. The reality, however, was much bleaker than a ghost story. It turned out to be a woman on the top floor in absolute agony. Once I realized the sound was coming from a person in incredible pain and not a demon or a poltergeist, the fear turned into pure heartbreak. I work nights as a nurse at a few different facilities, but the oldest building in my rotation is haunted to the absolute limit. Most nurses will lie down and shut their eyes during their breaks, but I refuse to do it. We've seen cold shadows drift past too many times, watched doors swing open and shut on their own, and answered call lights in rooms that have been empty for days. There is one room in particular that carries a heavy weight. We had a patient code there, a sudden, desperate attempt at resuscitation, and it was an especially traumatic and messy scene. Every time I walk past that door during a night shift, the hair on my arm stands up and I'm hit with a wave of dread. Almost on cue, the hallway light outside that specific room will start to flicker as I pass. A few nights after that patient passed away, things took a violent turn. My coworker and I were standing in the unit when a large container was suddenly hurled off a high, stable shelf. It didn't just fall, it flew across the space and struck my coworker. She didn't even check for a mechanical cause. She just screamed out the dead patient's name. There is no doubt in my mind. That building is 100% haunted. I worked overnight park patrol in a quiet, rural village, based out of a small shack where I'd fill out my logs, listen to the radio, and flip through the 3 basic channels on a fuzzy TV. It was usually peaceful, but one night, the local wildlife decided to change the vibe. Around 11 p.m., I stepped out to check the trails and spotted a coyote at the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. It watched me for a moment before slipping back into the woods as I headed down the stairs. I didn't think much of it. Coyotes are common enough, and it seemed appropriately wary of me. When I went back out for my 1 a.m. rounds, there were 2 of them. They were standing in the exact same spot, staring intently. This time, they didn't run. I had to make some noise and wave my arms to finally spook them back into the brush. The situation peaked around 3 a.m. The moment I cracked the door, I realized they were no longer at the tree line. They were waiting right at the bottom of my steps. I let out a yell and stomped my foot to drive them off, but instead of backing down, the one in front started trotting up the stairs toward me. I slammed the door and locked it, deciding right then that my walking rounds were officially over for the night. For the next hour, I could hear the light pitter-patter of paws pacing directly outside the door. Just before sunrise, the silence broke with a frantic chorus of barking and growling, sounding like a fight had broken out just out of sight. I checked the windows on the opposite side of the shack, but the darkness revealed nothing. That was my last night on that job. Eastern coyotes are a different breed. They lack the typical fear of humans, and being hunted at your own doorstep is a level of creepy that no paycheck is worth. Sometimes a real animal is far more territorial and unsettling than any ghost. I was working the graveyard shift as a care aide in a nursing home, a job that usually oscillates between heavy silence and frantic activity. One particular night was grueling. It was 3 a.m., and I was rushing down the hallway to answer 2 simultaneous call bells, arms loaded with a fresh diaper and a stack of cloths. The unit was laid out as a long, central corridor with pods of rooms at either end. I was just about to cross onto the next floor when the air was shattered by a woman's voice. It was young, loud, and came from the absolute opposite end of the unit. The sound was jarring. It had the volume and suddenness of a TV being flicked to full blast for a split second and then immediately muted. I whirled around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Total silence. The floor was dead quiet again, making the outburst feel even more impossible. I stood there for a long moment, straining my ears for a footstep, a door creak, or any logical explanation for what I'd just heard. I was exhausted, but I knew one thing for certain. There were no young women residing on that unit. After a few seconds of hearing nothing but the hum of the building, I turned back toward the call bells and kept moving. I've learned that nothing good comes from investigating impossible sounds in the middle of the night, especially in a building where people come to spend their final days. Working the graveyard shift at a fast food joint isn't exactly a hotbed for the paranormal, but it's definitely a front row seat to the rawest parts of the human experience. Most of what I see involves the local homeless population and people struggling with addiction, and the stories are usually more tragic than they are mysterious. One night, a local dealer came through the doors in a total panic. He had lost a backpack full of product and was convinced he'd left it in our lobby. He was frantic, repeatedly trying to vault over the counter to search our prep area himself. We hadn't seen a bag, and neither had any of the customers, which meant it had likely vanished into the night long before he realized it was gone. The hallucinations are a regular occurrence, too. I remember a man on a meth bender stumbling in and screaming about the wolves patrolling the parking lot. He was terrified, begging us to call animal control because he was convinced the pack was waiting just outside the glass doors to tear him apart. The reality of the location is often much grimmer than that. We've had a customer die of an overdose in the bathroom, and not long ago, a homeless man was tragically run over by a dump truck right in our own parking lot. Among all that chaos, there was one guy who stood out, a really kind man who came in every single night. He'd buy a soda and a small burger, plug his tablet into a wall outlet, and watch videos until he eventually drifted off to sleep. He always tucked himself into a booth in the very back and never bothered a soul. It always bothered me how other customers would complain about his presence or even try to take it upon themselves to kick him out. He was just a person trying to get through his life in peace. There was no reason not to just leave him be. I used to work the swing shift. I'm not sure if that qualifies for a night shift horror story, but what I saw was definitely chilling. I was heading out one evening and passed through the back parking lot of a local shopping center. It was mostly deserted, except for 2 cars parked trunk to trunk in the shadows. One of the trunks was wide open, and even from a distance, I could see it was absolutely packed to the brim with high-capacity rifles and various other firearms. It was clearly a major weapons deal going down right in the open. I didn't stick around to see who was buying or selling. I just noped out of there as fast as my car would take me. When I first started working with the medical examiner, one of the deaners asked me to handle the autopsy prep. Because of the pathologist's schedule, we typically worked at dark o'clock in the morning, which meant I had to show up an hour before the crack of dawn to get everything ready. There I was, a kid fresh out of college, standing in a morgue at 3 a.m., surrounded by the deceased. I remember thinking to myself, this is exactly how every horror movie starts. The decedent I had to prep was a larger individual, and I had to transfer the body from the gurney to the autopsy table by myself. Being new to the job, I was struggling with the weight. As I heaved the torso upward to slide it onto the stainless steel, a low, drawn-out wheezing sound escaped the person's mouth. If I hadn't spent years studying anatomy and physiology, I probably would have dropped the body, risking the integrity of the autopsy, and bolted out of the building in a state of pure terror. Even with my training, it was deeply unsettling. I had to take a breath and remind myself of the science. Air often remains trapped in the lungs after death, and by exerting pressure on the chest, I had simply forced that air up through the trachea. Still, having a corpse moan like a literal ghost while you're alone in a room full of bodies in the dead of night is an experience that stays with you. It was a literal graveyard shift with a perfectly logical explanation, but that didn't make the silence of the morgue any less heavy afterward. I constantly see strange shapes and movement lurking just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Usually, these figures appear as dark silhouettes passing between me and a distant, glowing neon sign. They always seem hunched over, creeping along with a slow, predatory gait that feels incredibly unsettling. However, since I live in a rural city, the monsters always turn out to be deer out for a midnight stroll. It's funny how quickly your brain jumps to the supernatural when you're standing in an abandoned lot in the middle of the night. It turns out deer look creepy as hell in the dark when you think you're completely alone. I was working the graveyard shift at a grocery store in a town that definitely didn't need 24-hour service. After midnight, the place was a ghost town. The only people who ever poked their heads in were the occasional police officer or paramedic grabbing a coffee. At about 2 a.m., a man walked in. I'd guess he was at least 60 years old. He walked with a heavy limp, looked as if he had soiled himself, and radiated an intensely creepy energy. He bypassed all the aisles and walked straight to my register with empty hands. Leaning in, he gave me a haunting, jagged grin and asked, "Do you have any pepper spray?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Sorry, sir, we don't sell pepper spray here." He didn't blink. "No," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Do you personally have pepper spray on you right now?" A cold wave of terror hit me. I realized in that second I was completely alone with him. I lied through my teeth and told him, "Yes, I do." Without another word, he turned around and limped out of the store. I spent the rest of the night looking over my shoulder, clutching my phone in one hand and a jagged piece of wood I'd ripped off a shipping pallet in the other, waiting for him to come back. He never did, but that was the very last time I ever worked that shift. I used to work for an organization just outside London that operated like a bit of an old boys club. The director was an elected position with a lot of prestige. Those appointed usually took the post in their 60s and stayed for decades. One director in particular was legendary for his devotion to the job. He worked in his office until 9 p.m. every single night and eventually died in office before he could retire. By the time I joined, the organization was winding down and preparing to move abroad. The staff had been gutted, leaving only about 10 of us in a 1970s-era building designed for 50. Since I worked on specific projects, I occasionally stayed late, while everyone else vanished by 5 p.m. The first night I worked late, I was sitting at my desk when 9 p.m. arrived. Precisely on the hour, I heard a door slam upstairs, followed immediately by a second one. Then, I heard the elevator, an ancient analog machine, engage and travel to the top floor. The doors slid open, then snapped shut much faster than they ever did when the sensor was left to its own devices. The lift immediately descended to the ground floor and opened once more. A few seconds later, the heavy front door rattled as if someone were pulling it shut. When I went to investigate, the front door was bolted solid. I brushed it off as a strange building quirk until it happened again the next night, identical in every detail. On the third night, I went upstairs at 7 p.m. to personally ensure every door was shut and the floor was empty. Like clockwork, at 9 p.m., the sequence repeated perfectly. I never quite had the nerve to be upstairs when the hour struck. The most unsettling part came later when the elevator was being serviced. I bought the technician a coffee and asked him about the circuitry, wondering if there was a timer or a program test cycle. He looked at me blankly and told me there was no clock, no timer, and nothing in the hardware that could trigger a move on its own. I worked the graveyard shift at a gas station, and one particular night had been a total disaster. Between the junkies tweaking in the aisles and customers generally acting like it was a full moon, I was on edge. At one point, the store finally emptied out. My coworker headed into the back freezer, and I took the opportunity to restock the cigarettes, standing behind the counter with my back to the front door. Suddenly, a voice directly behind me said, "Glad to see you made it through the night." I spun around so fast I nearly took out a display rack, my heart hammering in my throat. The store was completely empty. No one was at the door, no one was in the aisles, and my coworker was still tucked away in the back. I stood there in the silence, genuinely spooked, wondering if the stress of the night had finally made me snap. It wasn't until my next shift that the mystery was solved. As it turns out, our cash registers are programmed to talk to us. giving reminders about phone scams or company policies. At a specific time during the shift, the register chime triggers a pre-recorded message. Glad to see you made it through the night. And then, the voice drops an octave and finishes with, without having any problems. Knowing that didn't make the voice any less jarring, but it definitely made me feel better about my own sanity. I manage a remote kennel, a job that often requires staying late to handle feedings, medications, and the general needs of the animals. One evening, I was stuck late finishing up payroll and didn't manage to head out until shortly after 8 p.m. The facility is fairly isolated, at least a 15-minute drive from the nearest business or house. As I was wrapping things up, something on the glass office door caught the light and made me freeze. Outlined perfectly in the evening humidity on the exterior of the glass were 2 human handprints. The sight was unsettling enough given that we had been closed to the public for hours, but the placement was what truly disturbed me. The prints were located at the very top of the door, far higher than anyone would naturally lean. This wouldn't have been quite so strange if they were adult-sized, but these prints were tiny, no larger than the hands of a small child. There was no logical reason for a child to be out in the middle of nowhere in the dark, let alone reaching for the top of an office door. I haven't seen them since, and I still can't wrap my head around how they got there. I was working the night shift as a security guard for a beachfront resort, pulling the 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. slot. A routine part of my rounds involved heading down the long boardwalk to the beach to ensure no one was trespassing or causing trouble on the sand after hours. Around 2 a.m. one night, I stepped out onto the boards and swept my flashlight across the shoreline. Just along the water's edge, I spotted what looked like a small girl in a white dress. Seeing a child alone at that hour was alarming, so I called out to see if she was lost. She stopped and turned toward me, and as the beam of my flashlight hit her face, her eyes flashed with a bright, predatory reflection. I didn't wait for a second look. I noped all the way back across the boardwalk and sprinted to my office. I slammed the door, bolted it, and sat down to update my logs, fully intent on pretending the last 5 minutes had never happened. I had just finished the entry when a single, violent bang shook the door. I let out a scream and sat frozen, staring at the handle, barely breathing. I stayed locked in that room for a full 30 minutes before I finally gathered enough courage to step out for my next check. As I opened the door, I looked down at the threshold and felt my stomach drop. I found myself wondering if the hallway outside my office had always been covered in that much wet, heavy sand. I'm a police officer, and there's a specific wooded area in my city that sits atop a mountain. In the center of the woods, a clearing opens up to a sheer cliff face overlooking the valley below. Growing up, we called it Recreation Point. It was the local spot for bonfires and teenage drinking. Over the decades, it claimed several lives. Some people jumped, while others simply stumbled over the edge in a drunken haze. A few years ago, the land was sold and cleared for an upscale housing development. The area immediately bordering the cliff remained wooded, however, and the old trail was still intact. One night, feeling bored and a bit nostalgic, I decided to patrol the area. I hadn't been there since high school and figured I'd take a look under the guise of checking for trespassers. The trail begins at the very back of the neighborhood. I parked my cruiser where the pavement ended and started into the trees. At the time, the houses were still under construction, empty shells with no residents and no cars anywhere nearby. Given how isolated this mountain is, I was fairly certain I'd be the only soul out there. That certainty vanished when I heard the voices. There were two of them, distinct and clear, a man and a woman. I was too far off to catch the words, but the cadence of a conversation was unmistakable, and it was coming directly from the clearing ahead. I assumed it was just a couple of kids hanging out. I'd just tell them to move along and head back to my car. As I moved closer, the voices grew louder, echoing through the dark. I finally reached the end of the trail and stepped out into the open clearing. And the world went dead silent. The second my boots hit that clearing, the voices cut out. There is only one trail in or out, and I was standing on it. The only other options were to go crashing through the thick, dry underbrush, which I would have heard instantly on such a quiet night, or to go over the cliff. I scanned the area with my light, making absolutely sure no one was hiding in the shadows. The clearing was empty. I didn't stick around. I turned and made my way back down the trail toward my car, moving a lot faster than I'd ever care to admit to my colleagues. I don't scare easily, but the hair on my neck was standing straight up, especially when, the moment I was back under the cover of the trees, the voices started up again in the clearing behind me. I don't believe in ghosts. Logically, I know there must be a rational explanation, sound carrying from a distant house, birds, or my own mind playing tricks in the dark. But I know what I heard, and I know it stopped the exact moment I stepped into that space. It was unsettling, to say the least. I worked at Kohl's for a few years, often pulling the overnight shifts to handle the clearance markdowns. Among the staff, there was a running theory that the men's department was haunted. I even gave the resident spirit a name, Robert, though I have no idea where the name came from. It just felt right. One night, I was working in the men's section entirely by myself. I had been organizing several stacks of wide, sturdy boxes. These weren't precarious towers. They were only stacked 2 or 3 high and were very stable. I was sitting several feet away, focused on printing clearance labels and listening to my music when the boxes suddenly tumbled over. I got up, restacked them, and sat back down. A few minutes later, they were knocked over again. There was no draft, and I was nowhere near them. Finally, I'd had enough. Without looking up, I just said, "Robert, I'm here by myself, and I'm just trying to work, so stop it." The activity ceased instantly and didn't happen again for the rest of the night. From then on, I made it a point to always check in and say something to him before I started a shift in his section. It just made things easier. A few years back, I worked the graveyard shift for a security firm contracted by an electric company. My post was a remote substation about 15 minutes outside of town, tucked deep into the desert. One night, a car drove past, nothing unusual in itself, but since I was there to guard the copper, I had to keep a close eye on any vehicle that lingered near the fence line. The car didn't stop at the gate. Instead, it continued another 300 or 400 meters down the road before pulling off. From my vantage point, I could see the glow of the headlights and hear the muffled sounds of car doors slamming and distant voices echoing across the flat desert floor. I watched for a bit, but since they weren't bothering the equipment, I didn't think much of it and eventually turned back to my rounds. A few days later, a friend of mine mentioned that his father, who ran a towing business, had been called in by the police to haul away a car used in a homicide. As the story went, a group of men had gotten into a fight that turned fatal when one was accidentally killed with a baseball bat. To cover their tracks, the killer and an accomplice drove out into the middle of nowhere to bury the body. It hit me then that I hadn't just watched a random car stop in the desert. I had unknowingly stood watch as a shallow grave was dug just a few hundred meters away. I used to work at a sprawling, historic cemetery as a groundskeeper. Because it was so old, there was no modern irrigation, so my entire shift consisted of manually watering all the plants and flowers. One afternoon, while I was making my rounds, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. About 50 yards away, near a dense bush, I saw what I assumed was a homeless man crouched down as if he were relieving himself. I started heading over to tell him he couldn't be there, but as I got closer, the figure seemed to vanish behind the foliage. When I reached the spot, there was no one there, just a fresh, dark pool of blood soaking into the grass. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I ran straight to the owner's office to report what I'd found. We headed back to the spot immediately, but when we arrived, the blood was gone. In its place was nothing but a pile of those cheap, gaudy plastic flowers you'd find at a discount dollar store. There was no blood, no person, and no footprints. To this day, I have no idea what I actually witnessed or how a pool of blood could turn into a heap of fake carnations in the span of 3 minutes. I was working the early morning hours in a retail outlet, getting the floors cleaned before the doors opened for the day. A very well-dressed man suddenly approached the front entrance and tried the handle. When he found it was locked, he leaned in until his face was pressed flat against the glass. He licked the window several times, his eyes fixed on the interior, then turned and disappeared into the morning light. Later, while working as a security guard at a chemical plant in a completely different part of the country, I spotted someone moving near the perimeter gates. The man was scurrying back and forth across the gateway, but he was hunched over, moving in a strange, crab-like crawl. I flipped on the floodlights to see what was going on, and he moved so fast it was jarring. He vanished from the line of sight in maybe half a second, leaving me completely rattled.